So hello there and welcome to another episode of the DNF1 F1 podcast. My name is Adam Burns, one of your co-hosts, and joining me once again, my other co-host, it's Mr. Courtney Pine. Courtney, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. There's a lot to discuss tonight, so I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, and first things first, what a climax to the British Grand Prix that we had. Of course, last weekend just gone was the British Grand Prix, and considering the race started out, and for long periods of it turned out to be quite a bit of a bore fest, I think was fair to say. It certainly finished on an absolute climactic note. Of course, for those of you that didn't see the race, just to refresh your memories, that Lewis Hamilton dominating the entire race with Valterri Bottas within a few seconds of him, as Mercedes drivers so often do when they're running 1 and 2. They have not been given permission to fight just yet. And towards the end of the race, with just a few laps to go, Valtteri's pace started to decline, falling into the clutches of Max Verstappen. And then that's when the chaos ensued. Valtteri Bottas's front left tyre completely delaminated 2 laps from the end as he exited Luffield, I think it was. No, not Luffield, it was into Abbey in the first corner. His tyre completely delaminated, leaving him to have to crawl with basically 3 tyres all the way round the track, losing bucket loads of time to get into the pit lane.
Yeah, it was almost a full lap, wasn't it?
Exactly, yeah. Get into the pit lane, second place was lost, third place was lost as well for Valtteri, to the point where he didn't even finish in the point at the end of the race, which we will discuss, of course. But then, considering that we thought, could it get any worse for Mercedes, the unthinkable happened. Lewis Hamilton, usually the man who often complains about the life and quality of his tyres and then goes and sets the fastest lap, ended up having the exact same issue as his teammate a lap later, although a bit further down the track, coming out the exit of Brooklands and Luffield, so a bit further down the track than Valtteri. But fortunately for Lewis Hamilton, remarkably, he was able to not only carry on with 3 wheels, but managed to come across the line in first place ahead of a very quick charge in Max Verstappen, who, I think it's fair to say, Courtney, despite getting a second place he never expected, will be very disappointed with the strategy call from his Red Bull team, as they pitted him straight after before Valtteri had the issue, I should say, to put on fresh tyres to go for a fastest lap, without realising that if he hadn't have done, with the benefit of hindsight, he would have won the race. And unfortunately, seeing Lewis trot across the line as he was coming through the final corner, too little too late, unfortunately, but what a climax that was to that race. I must say, it did take me a while to get over the absolute shock value of it. What was it like for you, Courtney, as a Mercedes fan? You must have been sweating buckets.
Yeah, I'm not gonna lie to you. At one point, I was pacing around the living room with my hands behind my head. I'm not gonna lie to you. And I saw the time going down and down between him and Max, and I did just a scene creeping over the line. There have been a lot of things online. It reminded us of the scene from Cars. You know, when he limps across the line with a puncture.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah,
Cars did.
Yeah.
It did remind me of that, but it's just so many faults, because particularly when you're a fan of a particular driver, you're not only thinking about the race itself, you're thinking about the championship. And with Mercedes being so dominant, most people like to think that the championship is most likely going to be between Lewis and Valtteri. So you've gone from seeing Lewis's main championship contender being out the points. And I didn't cheer, to be honest. I'm not like that. Unless you're waiting to the championship is from another team, I didn't cheer. I was like, because Valtteri's a likeable guy. But I saw it and I thought, okay, deep inside I was like, okay, this is good for the championship. And then bang. Because I expected them to bring Lewis in, so I was a little bit nervous. And then when it happened, I was like, oh no, they've gone and fucked it. And as pleased as I was to see him cross the line, I can't help but think that if I was a neutral fan, my heart would have sunk for, I don't know, the championship going forward, because I know we're only 4 races in, but if you're neutral, you'd be thinking, Jesus, both championships are already dead.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's even before we even talked about qualifying. I mean, we completely forgot how dominant Mercedes were in qualifying. Both cars qualified over a second faster than the next fastest car, which was Max Verstappen in the Red Bull. And then obviously the rest of the pack kind of fell line as third within a tight proximity of each other. It's very demotivating for the other teams to see how dominant Mercedes have become. It seems that Mercedes have somehow broken the proverbial glass ceiling, as we so often say with them, and have reached heights that even I don't think any of us could even imagine how good that car could possibly be. They are literally rewriting the history books and rewriting the rule books on how to build a Formula 1 car. It's incredible what they're doing. And as a result, they've got a championship battle which they've completely taken for themselves on both fronts, with the constructors' title almost seemingly like it's going to stay in Brackley. Of course, never say never, but it's going to take a mammoth effort from anybody, probably the largest we'd ever seen in Formula 1, for that to change hands. And of course now, with that incident with Valtteri and Lewis, when Lewis managing to secure first place, Valtteri failing to finish in the points as a result, was not able to pass a very much slowed Sebastian Vettel, or out of sorts Sebastian Vettel, on the final lap to try and take a point, was unsuccessful, and therefore Lewis has now increased his lead to 30 points. And in a championship like this, Courtney, where we've got limited number of races, of course we don't know how many we're going to get this season. We're up to, I think, 13 at the moment, I believe, if my maths is right. I might be wrong, but I think it's around about 13. We're at this point now where Valtteri Bottas cannot afford to have to chase down a deficit as large as what Lewis currently has right now in order to win the championship.
Because sorry, mate. Because the problem is, the phrase is coming out again. I have to make a drinking game for the 2014 to 2016 reference I like to make. The problem is that because Mercedes are so dominant, if you're the second place, like in the championship between the two drivers, you're only really going to be taking a maximum of 8-point gap to the driver in front in the usual race, if it's going to be a 1-2 finish pretty much every week. So it's already at the point now where Valtteri is going to have to rely on luck to bring himself back into the championship. And I touched on it earlier on. As a Lewis Hamilton fan, great. I know I'm not showing much enthusiasm, but it's great to see. I've watched him for years, and he's on the verge of statistically being the best driver of all time, and I'm thrilled for that. And on the other side, I can see how other fans feel, and they must be thinking his championships are dead. So, you always want to have a big spectacle as a fan of the sport. But who knows? Who knows? Reliability could come into it. There could be Valtteri could go on a run of form. You don't know. So I don't want to be too cocky. But as of now, you can sense that mind the pun. A lot of F1 fans are a bit deflated about the championship at the moment.
Yeah, and I think we should stress that's not Mercedes' fault. I mean, let's assume that everything that they've done is legal, because of course the one argument that a lot of fans have is, especially following the controversy regarding the legality of the Ferrari engine, which obviously we know something was up that the FIA were not happy about, hence why Ferrari are as much as 60 horsepower down on where they were last season, according to some tabloids. It seems that because of that, and obviously what Mercedes are doing, a lot of fans have been complaining about that Mercedes, saying, oh, maybe they should be looked into as well to see if that car's legal. The simple issue is that when you have a suspicion that a rival team is not doing something by the rules, you kind of have to prove it. You can't just simply go to the FIA and say that Mercedes is illegal, strip it apart and check everything. You can't. The FIA would not accept a protest on that level. And this is kind of leaning towards what Racing Point did. Sorry, not Racing Point, I should say Renault did with Racing Point. Yeah. They picked out the brake ducts in particular, as we mentioned in a previous episode, to get the FIA to look at that, investigate it, and if they find that it's breaching the regulations in terms of intellectual property that we talked about, then they will have means to check the rest of the car on those level of suspicions. You can't simply just do that with Mercedes unless you have evidence. It's as simple as that. Whether that car is legal or not, we don't know. We just have to assume that they are doing everything possible. And to be honest, given their history of how brilliant they've been, there's no reason in my mind to suggest that they are doing anything illegal. They're just rewriting the book on how to make a Formula 1 car. But moving that aside, obviously their increase in performance and reliability, they've always had to manage their reliability. They've always found performance gains as a result of that. Ferrari being taken down because of their engine issues, which I think is fair to say on most tracks can cost them as much as 6-7 tenths a lap.
Yeah.
When you take all that into consideration, Mercedes would still be dominating, and they would probably be around half a second faster than Ferrari at most tracks. So it doesn't really change the overall picture. You just have Ferrari where we probably expect them to be at the front, just a bit further away from the Mercedes we would like. And Red Bull as well. They've so often said that they've got a very competitive car underneath them. They just need to unlock that sweet spot, if you like, to find it. As far as I'm concerned as a fan, I hear that and I still wonder and ask myself, why is it we talk about Red Bull being the kings of developing their car in the season, and yet they always seem to start the season with a car that's at least half a second slower than the Mercedes? In this case, it's a second in Max Verstappen's hands, so we only have to assume that you can add an extra few tenths on top of that, because we know Max drives the wheels off his Red Bull every time. So the actual pace of that Red Bull is probably more closer to the midfield than they would care to admit. It just creates...
You see it with Albon. I think Albon's getting a lot of stick for his performance, but I think that's partly down to the car.
In a large way, I mean, the cars are not specifically designed to suit one particular driver. Yes, there are hallmarks that will be put in place to suit one driver over the other, but the idea is the car will be designed to be as fast as possible, given the philosophy that the designers will adopt when designing a Formula 1 car. Red Bull and Mercedes are great examples where Red Bull is going to be a very high rake car, Mercedes a very low rake car. And for those of you unfamiliar with what rake is, basically rake is the angle what the rear of the car is facing, whether it's pointing further downwards and the rear end is a bit higher. And there's different ways in which you can look at how that concept works. We won't get into too much details, but where Red Bull were extreme on that concept, Mercedes' car is a lot more lower down. And there are benefits, tangible benefits if you like, on both sides. But it seems Mercedes have been able to extract more performance from their philosophy, whereas Red Bull, to a point, have not been as successful. Now, some of you might ask, well, why don't Red Bull just design a car like Mercedes? Unfortunately, it's not as simple as that. Because not many teams, believe it or not, almost every single team, with the exception of probably Racing Point, have gone for the high rake philosophy like Red Bull. Ferrari was sort of in between both sides and then went more the Red Bull method. But unfortunately, you can't just simply change philosophy without having a massive overhaul of your car. We talked about this on a previous episode where you can't put the Mercedes front wing on a Williams or a Ferrari and expect it to go faster. It's just so much more complex than that. But what you end up having is a situation where we've got a 2-driver championship, and until Valtteri Bottas finds another level, which to his defence and to his credit, he is competing against arguably one of the greatest drivers in Formula 1 history. I just don't feel he has that extra something, as good as he is, to beat Lewis Hamilton. Rosberg had it, and he demonstrated it, and Rosberg had to go to certain depths, which some might find controversial, looking back on, and perhaps not in the spirit of the sport, but he still got it done. And I must say,
strangely enough, I can't believe I'm saying this. You didn't hear me saying this a few years ago. I've kind of, watching the past 3 years, I've actually developed a bit more respect for Rosberg, considering that he pushed Lewis the way he did, because Valtteri's no slouch. Valtteri's not a bad driver, but the fact that it just seems to be so much easier for Lewis, it just suggests that, Rosberg, was a better driver than maybe I gave him credit for. It's just because where Lewis is so exceptionally good that he still beat Rosberg.
Yeah. No, and Rosberg's resume will be actually a lot better than a lot of people actually think. I mean, we're talking about the only driver to have successfully beaten Michael Schumacher and Lewis Hamilton in a Formula 1 season. We were potentially talking about a man that's beaten 2 drivers with, perhaps at the end of this season, 14 world championships between the 2 of them. Arguably, not arguably, the 2 most decorated drivers of all. But I mean, that's perhaps a discussion for another day. I mean, long story short, Lewis Hamilton, once again, a remarkable piece of driving, to be so calm, use his experience. I mean, there was a moment on that lap corner, I don't know if you saw this, Anthony Davidson and Karen Chanduk did look into this after the race, but there was a moment in Stowe Corner where the old turn 1 used to be for some of the veteran fans at Silverstone. Lewis actually made a adjustment on his steering wheel on the differential, which allowed the car to lean more towards the right hand side where the inflated tyres were. He still had two inflated tyres. Obviously, the one that delaminated was on the front left.
Yeah.
And that allowed the car to lean a bit more towards the right, which gave him a bit better balance, so he could put his foot down the hanger straight and go through Maggots and Beckett's without too many issues. It's stuff like that when, as Lewis said, it was a heart-in-the-mouth moment. He didn't panic. Yes, he was concerned about the gap behind him and that this was a race that could get away from him in his home turf. But he just did what great champions, elite-level drivers do. Used his experience, stayed calm, made the necessary adjustments and brought it home. And you have to hold your hand up and say, well, considering that we thought he was going to dominate at this and he won it in the manner he did, that is incredible props to him. Incredible props. I mean, we've seen incredible drives in the past in times of adversity. I'm thinking back to some of the older fans would remember Emerson Fittipaldi had the same issue in 1973 in Spain, where after he won the race, it was found that one of his rear tyres had completely deflated by 50%. And then you had the 1991 Brazilian Grand Prix, Ayrton Senna, Courtney, you remember, won that race where he drove the last 10-15 laps in only 6th gear to a point where he's completely exhausted after he could barely stand on the podium to hold his trophy. And that's when Formula 1 cars, the gearboxes were so much more difficult to drive than they are now. And of course, Michael Schumacher in 94 in the Benetton, where half of that race he drove in 5th gear. It's those sorts of drives that we haven't seen a moment like that from Lewis, I think is fair to say, or at least in my memory. But to see him finish the race in the manner he did, so calm and experienced, alright, it was granted for only half a lap, but he still had to do it. I mean, that's just incredible stuff. I don't think we can argue anything against how brilliant that was from him to be able to just be calm, relax, make the adjustments and bring the car home. It was incredible stuff.
Yeah, there's always this argument, the usual argument of he's in the best car. First of all, every Formula 1 driver that has great records have had great cars. Michael Schumacher had some great cars, even Ayrton Senna. Ayrton Senna had one of the most dominant cars in Formula 1 history. You know, let's remember that. Let's remember that. And I just feel that like Lewis he's already been faced with, you know, changeable weather conditions, delaminated tyre, protests and penalties, and he's still going strong. You know, if he wasn't the calibre of driver that a lot of us think he is, he wouldn't be anywhere near the level that he's at. If he was this fraud that some people think that he is because he drives a Mercedes, he would have been making mistakes like Valtteri has. Do you get what I mean?
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. And I think it's fair to say that, yes, all of the elite drivers have all driven the best car on the grid at some point. I mean, Schumacher had, I would say, for 2 or 3 seasons, had the best car on the grid by a country mile. Particularly 2002, 2004, the Ferrari was unbelievable. Ayrton Senna, as we said, in the early 90s, in the McLaren, had an incredible car as well that completely obliterated the field. They've all had that at some point, and I don't understand why this is a valid argument that some people think that you have to take something away from Lewis for having the best car. Of course, the best drivers are always going to want to be in the best car. Why would Lewis Hamilton, as tempting as it may be for him as a fan, and obviously everybody wanted to drive for them, but why would Lewis leave Mercedes where they are now to join Ferrari where they are now? Why?
Exactly.
Because you're basically just giving up effectively 2 or 3 world championships that he can claim for himself in the best car. It makes no sense to appease those fans. They just find something else to knock him with, and I just find that annoying. That
yeah, you know, like even in 2017 and 2018, we've had the discussion many times. I think Ferrari had the fastest car in those seasons.
It certainly did in 2018. 2017, it was probably 50-50. Mercedes outdeveloped them towards the end of the season, but 2018, yeah, Ferrari should have won that world championship that season with Sebastian Vettel.
We saw some great drives from Lewis,
and we said that Lewis would have won the championship definitely in 2018 in that Ferrari. 2017 maybe if he swapped cars with Vettel, but definitely 2018. So, no, I don't think it's a fair argument for some people to knock Lewis for having the best car. If you want to stack him up against the all-time greats like the Schumachers, the Sennas, the Fangos, yes, there can be a caveat based on the fact that Mercedes have arguably had the best car for quite some margin for the last 5 of the last 7 seasons in the turbo hybrid era, at least.
Yeah, I agree with that.
But you can't knock him when you look at his stats. I mean, we're talking about a guy now that's got 91 pole positions. Without a doubt, the greatest qualifier Formula 1 has ever seen. I don't even think that's a debate. It's just fact. I mean, he's a country mile ahead of Schumacher and Senna and everyone else. There's just no one that's got anywhere near what he's got. And he's going to add to that. And now, of course, the illustrious race wins, which, again, we never thought anyone would get near Schumacher. But Hamilton now, 4 races away from equaling that. In my mind, he'll certainly beat that this season. I think there's enough races for him to do that. He could probably do that by the time we get to Mugello. Which I believe, if I'm right, Mugello will be the race which he could do it. I think the earliest he could do it. And of course, on Ferrari's home patch, which would be a bit of a blow for them. And of course, the World Championships. I think this season, Lewis has got to be now, if he wasn't already, the hot favourite for that. And it could well be the same next season. So, yes, we are talking about the driver who will most likely become the most decorated driver in Formula 1 world history. It doesn't necessarily make him the best, but it certainly goes a long way to ticking a lot of boxes if you want to be considered that high in that high regard.
But that's what I find. But that's what I love about the sport, though. You know, for a sport that is so stats obsessed.
Yeah, we love a stat.
We will always have our favourite. You know, our perceived best drivers of all time, you know, because I'll put it on Instagram page and I'll put down about how close he is to being, and that's why I stress statistically the best Formula 1 driver of all time. You can't argue against the stats in that sense, but there will always be statistically the best and the best in our hearts. So for you, I know it's Schumacher, and it always will be.
Well, yeah, I mean, sorry to cut you off there. I mean, yes, right now, if someone was to ask me who I thought was the greatest driver of all time, I would say Michael Schumacher. And there's a lot of reasons why I can argue that. But the more that Lewis racks up the numbers, it does sway more in his favour for that argument. But there's a lot more to it than just the stats, as much as we love them. But, of course, that's all down to subjective interpretation, I suppose. You're never going to get a definitive answer. It's always opinion. And everyone is entitled to it, so... Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, because like, for me, because I was just speaking the heart on this one, apart from, you know, Lewis and Michael Schumacher, I think the best of all time was Senna. And it isn't just because of his stats, it was just because what he offered the sport. You know, his driving style, he was always in the centre of everything that was going on around that time. You know, he was winning races in cars that shouldn't have won races. I look through his career, and I just think that is everything that a successful Formula 1 driver should be. He wasn't just winning every championship easily. He had massive difficulties, but most of the time he overcome them. And that's why, for me, he is in my opinion, he's one of the best of all times, despite only having 3 world championships. And even Fernando Alonso, like we've had the discussion again. You know, if you're going to base it on talent, 2 world championships don't do him enough justice.
I mean, yeah, Fernando's probably could have had 2 more in 2010 and 2012, most likely. He's definitely in my top 10, Fernando Alonso, of all time. But unfortunately, when we say stats don't always paint the full picture, the stats, unfortunately, for Fernando, when he stacks up to other drivers, doesn't weigh in his favour. Especially considering the choices he made and the team switches he did make, comparing to someone like Lewis Hamilton, where Fernando Alonso was not very good at changing teams. Lewis Hamilton was absolutely genius in terms of his driver moves. Although he's made one, he made the right one. And that can be the difference between being in Lewis Hamilton's position and having the legacy that Fernando Alonso have. But, of course, we'll digress on that. We've got other things to unpick for this race review. But I think it's probably a good opportunity now to take a little break for a little bit. So, grab yourself a drink, guys, and get yourself comfortable, and then we'll see you for the next part of the DNF1 F1 podcast. So hello, welcome back guys to the second part of the DNF1 F1 podcast. So in the first part we were just analysing the race and analysing obviously the big talking point with Lewis Hamilton winning in dramatic fashion and obviously Valtteri Bottas losing critical ground in the Drivers' Championship. Now the gap 30 points between the two Mercedes drivers, arguably the only two really that we feel that's going to have a chance of it this season considering how dominant Mercedes are. But nonetheless, let's look through the rest of the field and obviously talk about their races. Now, we mentioned briefly Red Bull and Max Verstappen. Cruel irony, I think, is probably the best way to describe how their race finished. A couple of laps from the end, they felt that they weren't going to be able to catch the two Mercedes or put pressure on them, despite it seemingly looking like Valtteri Bottas was losing a bit of ground and falling back towards Max. They went with the option to put him onto a fresh set of soft tyres for the last few laps, give him a few goes to try and get fastest lap, which he eventually did. But unfortunately, what he did not anticipate, or they didn't anticipate, was what happened to the Mercedes. And I think it's fair to say that if Red Bull decided to just leave him out, he would have caught Lewis Hamilton to win that race. So,
Yeah, he would have.
I mean, how did you see that, Courtney? Could you attribute any blame to them for not thinking like that, or do you think that they were just extremely unlucky for what happened to Mercedes to happen? And the timing that unfortunately prevented Max from taking his first win of the season.
I think Max actually worded it perfectly in the post-race press conference. Of course, there's always that frustration that they didn't win, but I do feel that not only did they pit him because of the because they were going for a faster lap, I do think they also pitted him as a precaution. Because if you've got cars around you getting, because let's not forget, it wasn't only Valtteri that got the puncture, Sainz had got one as well. So there's two separate cars from two separate teams that have like different performance levels. Both had punctures, so it wasn't just a one-team issue. So I do think they did it as a precaution, and in a way, despite his petulance sometimes on track, it does show a maturity in press conferences. And he put it perfectly. He said, if I'd come into going into that race, I would have taken second. He's I don't know. He's already seems to have a calm approach. He's just showing hallmarks of a world champion, despite not having won one yet.
Yeah, and it's becoming increasingly difficult for Max to kind of deal with the level of dominance that Mercedes are literally installing on the entire F1 paddock, because for years, since Max has been the lead driver at Red Bull, we've often talked about his quality and his speed and his raw genius behind the wheel to extract the maximum out of that Red Bull car, to a point where we just say, well, it's only a matter of time before Max has the car underneath him to win a world championship. We want to see Max go toe-to-toe with Lewis Hamilton in the same way that Fernando Alonso did with Michael Schumacher. You have the present and the future.
Or Schumacher and Senna as well.
Yeah, Schumacher Senna. We didn't get to see that enough, but there were moments where when the Benetton had improved significantly in 93 and where Schumacher was able to go toe-to-toe with Ayrton for some time. And we haven't yet got that. We've had glimpses. We've had moments. We had Hungary last year where Lewis hunted Max down. We've had Brazil last year, of course, where Max took it to Lewis, and of course, that incident involving Esteban Ocon preventing it. Not last year, the year before, I should say. Get my ears right. We've seen glimpses of that rivalry. We just haven't been able to see it over the course of a season. And until Red Bull can provide Max with a car that can go toe-to-toe with Mercedes, at least in his hands, it's going to become incredibly frustrating. So for Max to take that approach and be a bit more mature, as you've often said, he's been quite petulant sometimes with the media and how he reacts to certain levels of adversity. He's doing the best job he can. It's very, very unfortunate not to be able to get that win, but under the circumstances, you're absolutely right. He'd have took second place if it was offered to him in a heartbeat to beat one of the Mercedes. And with that, do we feel that Red Bull at this present time are running the risk of putting Max in a situation where he's more interested in what Lewis Hamilton's contract situation is at Mercedes rather than Red Bull's own development? Because we're getting to that point now where Lewis himself has said he would probably want to stay at Mercedes for a few more years. For his last contract, we would imagine this will probably be. And then Max would be waiting to jump into that Mercedes when that seat becomes available. Because let's be honest, yes, Mercedes have George Russell on the books, ready to step in We most likely feel that will be for Bottas in 2022, quite possibly. But they do have to look longer term. And if they want to secure the driver of this current generation coming up, that's going to be dominating like Lewis has, probably have to look no further than Max.
Yeah, it is a tough situation because you imagine Lewis will be, he said 3 more years, didn't he, Max? That's what he said, 3 more years. And I know careers are a lot longer in Formula 1, but there will be a grand frustration. You can sense it. You can sense he's getting frustrated with the situation because, despite how well he handles it, there is a lot of pressure, from he's got a very passionate fan base. He's the main man at a team that are desperate for another world championship. And there will come a point where, he'll be thinking, say that 3 years. He's 22 now, isn't he?
Yeah, he seems like he's been in Formula 1 forever. Yeah, 22, 23, I think, yeah.
So, if Lewis stays in Formula 1 for another 3 years, let's say, and for whatever reason he continues to perform at this level, as do Mercedes, he could get to the point where he's 26 years of age and hasn't won a world championship yet. And, he's been in the sport for, nearly 10 years without winning the world championship?
Yeah, when it seems like, yeah.
He'll start getting itchy feet. I agree. He'll start getting itchy feet. If Red Bull don't show significant improvement, or they don't have big plans in place for 2022, then he must start thinking, where do I go from here?
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. Red Bull are in this position where they've often said that they need to be able to provide their top drivers with the best resources available to go out and win races and world championships. And unfortunately for them, they're producing the next best car after the Mercedes, but the Mercedes is so much better than everything else at the moment that we're seeing. It's almost getting to a point now where they have to start worrying about, can they keep Max beyond 2023 when his current contract comes up? And that's a hard sale. 2022 is going to be a very, very important year for a lot of teams, but Red Bull especially. If they want to have a period of dominance again with Max Verstappen like they did with Vettel in the early 2010s, they're going to have to make sure that this new generation of car is absolutely spot on. And it is leaning towards the more simplicity of the aero side, so that might be where Adrian Newey will be able to shine. But of course, Mercedes have got plenty of brilliant aerodynamicists themselves, and of course Ferrari are going through a massive restructure to plan for 2022. So a lot of pressure on Red Bull, but for now I think Max would have been happy with the second, and hopefully gives them confidence to try and progress on for the season. That's 2 second places in the bag now and carry on from where they left off. Moving on from Red Bull, obviously we're going to talk about Ferrari. First things first, I think if any Ferrari fan or Charles Leclerc himself was offered a podium before a wheel was turned at Silverstone, I think they would have been biting your hand off all over the place. Because we said this in last week's episode, I expected this to be one of Ferrari's more difficult races of the season, where they were really going to suffer because of their lack of engine performance now as a result of the new engine they've had to build in such short notice. And Charles Leclerc drove, once again, a fantastic race like he did in Austria in the opening race of the season. Went about his business, managed to build up a gap to the McLarens, the Renaults and the Racing Point behind them. And he maintained that gap all through the race to a point where he was very fortunate to benefit from Valtteri's mishaps to take that podium position. So once again, a very impressive performance from Charles Leclerc. He didn't have the pace to catch and race with Max, certainly didn't have the pace to catch Lewis Hamilton, but nonetheless a very impressive drive from him once again, I think would be fair to say.
Yeah, Leclerc is the Max Verstappen of Ferrari. Underperforming car, extracting everything that he can out of the thing. And I don't know, it gives me encouragement as a neutral fan going into the post Lewis Hamilton era, because I've been thinking for a few years now that if Lewis was to retire, Lewis, Vettel, it would just be Max Verstappen dominating the sport, and I honestly don't think it's going to be that smooth sailing for him, the likes of Leclerc around, or even George Russell and Lando Norris if they continue to improve. But yeah, going back to Leclerc, he's definitely shown the hallmarks of a multiple world champion himself. So that encourages me as a neutral going forward.
Yeah, no, it's definitely absolutely right to say that. For those of you that are noticing some background noise, obviously I've mentioned before in previous episode that our current recording situation has changed in the last month or so. So I do apologise for any background noise that you do hear for the foreseeable future. There's not much I can do about that, but hopefully that will improve soon enough. So apologies on that front. Moving on, with Ferrari, of course, where Charles Leclerc has been outperforming the car and putting in another stellar performance this season, and in an otherwise very difficult year for Ferrari, where John Elkann talked about Ferrari having troubles and not really being able to return to race-winning form until 2022 at the earliest. Sebastian Vettel, on the other side of the garage, a driver who is leaving Ferrari at the end of the season to be replaced by Carlos Sainz, currently in the McLaren. But Sebastian Vettel, he looks completely lost out there. Where Charles obviously performing, getting the most out of the car, Sebastian struggled all weekend. He had problems, of course, with issues with the turbo in the Ferrari. He obviously had issues with the pedals being loose of some kind. They had to take off issues with the chassis as well. He just had such limited running time in practice, and of course qualifying he was off the pace, qualifying 9th, and then of course having his second lap chalked off, which meant he had to start 10th for exceeding track limits. And he just looked off the pace all weekend, to a point where he was overtaken by Pierre Gasly in an Alpha Tauri in outright pace, and then of course getting that point in the end, just about fending off Valterri Bottas, who had the issues with his tyre. So I guess my question, Courtney, on this subject is, what is happening to Sebastian Vettel? And I mean, what is going through his mind at the moment, in your perspective? Because clearly this is a man right now who mentally is having a very difficult time and seeming like the loneliest person in Formula One right now. And it's really affecting his race performance.
Yeah, as if you look back the past few years, he was the main rival, the main guy you'd be watching. You'd be watching Seb's times. What's Seb doing? What's happening with Ferrari? That was always like the main. He was the man to watch, and I don't want his career to end like this. In the 2000, from 2010 through to 2013, I've been wishing this kind of thing on him, but not now. He's you don't want to see it. Look, he's a 4-time world champion. He's offered a lot to the sport. Despite the stereotypes you get for a German driver for Ferrari, he's very charismatic. He's a funny guy, and it's not nice to see somebody that offers a lot to the sport and who is as talented as he is, just going downhill and going out the back door. We make the jokes about the spins over the past few years, but there has been a decline. You don't want to see, because he is a great at the sport, and you don't want to be seeing someone like that go out the ways, because he could just go out the back door of Formula One without a drive next season, and it'd be a massive shame.
Yeah, and I mean, of course, we should stress that right now it does seem likely that he's going to be joining Racing Point to replace Sergio Perez, who we'll talk about a little bit later. But right now, you're absolutely right, Corny. He seems like a shadow of the man that won 4 back-to-back World Championships, over 50 Grand Prix. You look at the man's stats and the way that he's driven in his career. We were talking about the all-time greats. He would be higher on that top 10 list, in my opinion, than Fernando Alonso. We talk about Alonso seemingly like the better driver, but unfortunately his career moves and the statistics that he has picked up compared to Sebastian would not argue that case in his favour. And we're talking about a man, as you've rightly pointed out, where Lewis Hamilton has had this era of dominance over the last 6-7 years. Sebastian Vettel, outside of his own team, has been the leading protagonist for that. And you'd almost feel like this generation in Formula One is the Hamilton-Vettel generation. Yeah. But where Hamilton is reaching new heights and reaching new levels that only 1 or 2 other drivers, perhaps 3 at a push, has ever reached, you sort of wonder, where is Sebastian Vettel? Has the fight gone? Is he now like Kimi Raikkonen, just driving for the fun of it? Because if he is, he's not having a lot of fun out there. It seems like Sebastian has become very secluded in the Formula One paddock, and as a fan, and a Ferrari fan, of course, as much as we tried to stay impartial at times on this podcast,
at
part
times.
of, a part, yeah, I know that's a push, but part of me's like, someone just needs to put their arm around him, like they did in the Red Bull days, just to make him feel some level of love and make him feel some level of support. Because right now, it just doesn't seem he's feeling that, and it's almost like you just want the poor guy to be put out of his misery. Like, it's not fun to be seeing a guy with his CV and Formula One legacy. Not that he cares often for having a legacy in Formula One, but it's become a very dark and lonely place for Sebastian Vettel, and I just hope that he's able to find a way to turn it around, because that fire, that burning passion he once had, it seems very, very damp at the moment. And his level of performance, alright, he struggled all weekend in this Ferrari. It was a real handful for him, and he never really got to grips with it for a lot of reasons, but he was well below par, and I don't know how this is going to get any better for him now that his future, albeit seems more increasingly certain by the week, it's not really doing him any favours right now, being in a Ferrari team that clearly has severed all ties from him in the most harsh fashion, and it's coming across in his racing this season.
Well, that was a concern. Remember when we put the video out about Batman leaving Ferrari? That was the main concern, wasn't it? That he's just going to sort of drive half-heartedly or be disruptive within the team. You said he won't be disruptive, and is leading in that direction. He isn't being disruptive. He's just driving almost soulless. You know, if you could make a description of soulless whilst driving a Formula One car, I think that's what we're looking at right now.
No, and it's a testament to the guy's character. I mean, we've so often talked about in the past how the real Sebastian Vettel isn't very well known in Formula One. He's not active on social media. He's the sort of guy that will... I mean, I was reading stuff on this a while ago. He's the sort of person that will go and visit local farmers in Switzerland where he lives, and... Oh, sorry, Switzerland and Austria where he lives. You know, find out about local produce, support them. He's very much a philosophical kind of guy. He likes to spend his spare time in his garage fixing up motorbikes. Of course, he'll never be able to replace the adrenaline Formula One gives him. He'll find a new way to channel that, I'm sure, like Lewis often does on motorbikes. But the sort of character that Sebastian exudes onto other people when they see him supporting the BLM movement quite emphatically in support of Lewis Hamilton, as Lewis has often praised him for it, this is the sort of person that you and I know that Sebastian is, and I feel like, particularly in the British media, isn't really portrayed on that same level. It's only recently people starting to wake up and realise the sort of person Sebastian is, and a much more likeable character than the one that people often loathed during his dominant period in Red Bull, and meme him when he was moaning about blue flags every 5 seconds. Now more likely the blue flag is going to be waved at him, if you can think about it. And I know it's a bit ironic us saying that because our outro song is based on that, but you know, it's not fun to see with Sebastian. I just hope, not just as a Ferrari fan, but as a fan of the sport, that somehow Sebastian can refine that passion. It may require someone like Lewis Hamilton to have a word with him and just say, like, you know, just to show him some love, because those two obviously almost like the best of friends in the paddock. They really are. Maybe that's what Seb needs, some sort of talk from someone like Lewis Hamilton or someone close to him to really try and invigorate that fire. Not to be defiant in Ferrari's direction, that's not what he is, but to sort of just remind him of who he is and what he's achieved in this sport and how respected he is, just to try and go out on the highest of highs before wherever he does go, whether it's retirement or Racing Point or somewhere else. I just hope that Sebastian can finish the season, or what's left of it, on a much higher note than he currently is, because right now it's not fun to watch. It's kind of like, you know...
That's why I feel a move to, well, Racing Point, who are going to go on to be Aston Martin, would be a great move for him. I think it would be like a new project, isn't a higher pressure environment like Ferrari. They're building something. I think it would be the perfect move for him right now. Got a Mercedes engine, a Mercedes engine in it. You know, it'll give him, and I just think he'd make a bit of a name for himself there, and it would give him that, you know, even if he doesn't, even if he's not winning races or challenging for a championship, I just think that will give him the boost that he'll need. So hopefully, as a fan of the sport, I'm hoping that he gets that move to Aston Martin next season. Yeah,
no, absolutely. But we'll obviously have to wait and see what happens. So just to go through some other stories over the weekend, of course, one that sticks to mind, the issue at Racing Point where Sergio Perez tested positive for COVID-19, the first driver to test positive for the virus. Fortunately, asymptomatic, so that means that he hasn't got any obvious symptoms, he just has the virus. So because of that, he's had to quarantine since Friday, just gone, and there's a lot of confusion over how long it's going to be, whether it's going to be 7 or 10 days, but of course we'll find out from the FIA if he's going to be able to take part next weekend. But what that resulted in was a very, very surprise return for Nico Hulkenberg. So Nico Hulkenberg, for those of you that weren't familiar with the name, was a Formula 1 driver up until last season with the Renault team, and of course lost his seat at Renault for Esteban Ocon coming in, was a former Racing Point driver in the Force India days, and I've got to say, Corny, I absolutely loved it when I got that notification on my phone to say that Nico Hulkenberg was going to be stepping in for Sergio Perez. Of course, we wish Sergio well, and hopefully he can come back soon, and hope he stays healthy. That's the important thing. But nonetheless, what a story that was, and could have shaped out to be in the race if for Nico to drive a car that, ironically, had the performance to get on the podium.
Yeah, it was actually nice to see a positive story come from a negative story involving COVID-19 for once this year. So hallelujah for that. Yeah, it's good to see him back, because me and you have had conversations about Nico Hulkenberg for years. We've always said that given the right car, he's definitely in that second tier of drivers at least. If he's given the right car, he would be challenging for wins at least. And that big move has always been elusive to him, hasn't it? And it was just after speaking about Sebastian Vettel, he went out the trap door of Formula 1, and it was a shame to see. So it was great to see him, even if it was just for one weekend, maybe next weekend. It's great to see him back, and and as I said, a positive story come from a negative in 2020. So more of that, please.
Yeah, he was always on the cusp of getting a drive at Ferrari. It was widely rumoured with Fernando Alonso back in 2013. Never really come to fruition. Of course, Kimi Raikkonen stepped in 2014 to replace Felipe Massa at the time. But Nico Hulkenberg, of course, with the unwanted record as the most races without a podium in Formula 1. Of course, a driver like that you would expect to have had one, but sadly that has missed him so far. In a car that could potentially have delivered that for him. Unfortunately, what happened was there was a problem with the car that prevented Racing Point from being able to start the race, and therefore Nico Hulkenberg did not start. Now, if the quarantine period that I believe is going to be upheld is 10 days rather than 7, that means Sergio Perez will not be able to take part in the British Grand Prix, although we should stress, or say British Grand Prix, the F1 and its 70th anniversary Grand Prix, although it will be at Silverstone again. That obviously, of course, yeah, we don't know that. We'll have to wait and see if that's confirmed. But until then, that's the assumption we're going with. Means that perhaps Nico may get another chance. And of course, with more experience than he had from the previous weekend's outings in practice and qualifying, he'll be much more competitive. And of course, he was on his teammates' pace, or very, very close to it. So hopefully, if Sergio's not able to compete this weekend, we may get to see Nico have a fair crack. And who knows, might get the podium that has so often eluded him in his Formula 1 career. We'll just have to wait and see. Going through the rest of the results, of course, some good results all around for Renault. 4th and 6th place, that's their best result in quite a while. Daniel Ricciardo equaling his best performance for Renault, finishing 4th. Esteban Ocon in 6th. Largely owed to Carlos Sainz having similar problems to the two Mercedes drivers on his front left tyre, delaminating and causing him to fall out the points. Lando Norris sporting that special helmet design from the young Eva, 6-year-old Eva, who entered a competition to design a helmet for Lando at the British Grand Prix, and he picked a beautiful looking helmet. Very, very nice gesture from Lando. And of course, Lando once again getting another 5th place for McLaren. So another strong drive from him. I've got to say, the driver of the day, without a doubt, Pierre Gasly. 7th place in the Alpha Tauri. Now, Alpha Tauri, for those of you that aren't familiar with the pecking order in Formula 1 this season, are sort of on the latter end of the midfield behind McLaren, Racing Point, Renault, and just about keeping ahead of the Haas is the Williams and the Alfa Romeo. So for Pierre Gasly, who quite often has loved driving around Silverstone, very successful around Silverstone, won in GP2, and last season in Red Bull got his best performance, finishing in the top 4. Excellent job yesterday's race. passing Sebastian Vettel, of course, in the Ferrari, and making a few moves on Lance Stroll as well, and finishing ahead of the driver that took his seat at Red Bull, Alex Albon. So what a drive from Gasly. And I think on a quick note, Courtney, with Pierre Gasly, since that podium in Brazil last season, that Pierre Gasly got his first podium in Formula 1 for Toro Rosso as it was then, he started to once again show that level of confidence and maturity and quality in his driving that Red Bull found very interesting to give him that promotion before. Is it fair to say, given the fortunes of both himself and his successor Alex Albon at the moment sort of going the other way, do we feel that perhaps Red Bull are keeping a close eye on Gasly potentially to re-promote him alongside Max Verstappen in the future? Because at the moment it looks like it's leaning towards that.
If I was from a Red Bull perspective, yes, I would be interested. But if I was Pierre Gasly, I wouldn't want to go back to Red Bull. I don't think he was treated particularly well whilst he was there. From a purely human perspective, if I was Pierre Gasly, I wouldn't want to go there. I'd be looking to go. I don't know. I'd be looking to see what's happening with. I don't know. If you're confident enough in yourself, let's see what's happening with the second seat at Mercedes, for example. Let's see how things go in a couple of years at Ferrari, because Pierre Gasly was clearly treated like a number 2 at Red Bull, so I just wouldn't understand why he'd want to go back there and be treated as such again. He's found his confidence again, and I imagine he just want to keep that rolling and see how things lead on from there.
Well, a lot of drivers in the past that kind of get treated and leave unceremoniously, as Pierre did in his Red Bull days last season, had a very difficult first half of the season where eventually was replaced by Alex Albon. Unlike other drivers like Danny Kvyat in the past, and maybe not Daniel Ricciardo, but a few other drivers in the Red Bull driver program that have lost their seats, they've tended to fall away and not really taken stock of where they are. I mean, Pierre Gasly's basically, in a nutshell, has taken stock of what's happened to him and thought, right, I'm still very lucky to have a seat in Formula 1 despite being demoted to the junior Red Bull team again. And he's basically worked hard, got his head down, refound that confidence, which I think that Brazilian Grand Prix podium last season was massive in terms of providing that confidence for this season. And he's putting in some stellar performances. He's outperforming Danny Kvyat. He's outqualified him in the last 6 races, I believe, in a row, dating back to last season. He is very much proving to be the next driver in line if Red Bull do decide that Alex Albon isn't cutting the mustard, for lack of a better phrase. And of course, on the other side, with Alex Albon, clearly not a slow driver. We talked about him last week where George Russell was defending him for Red Bull not being able to provide much for him. Again, Alex drove a good race getting back up to 8th, but qualifying seems to be the Achilles heel for the Red Bull driver. He's not showing that pace, and unfortunately in this modern era of Formula 1, you will be judged on your outright speed because it's so critical given the way the cars are designed now, where it's hard to overtake, harder than it's probably ever been. So Alex very much under the cosh. Of course, we're saying this knowing that he's potentially had 2 podium positions taken away from him, unfortunately by Lewis Hamilton, in Brazil and Austria respectively. And of course, if he was able to finish on the podium in those races, the picture would probably the outlook would be a lot different. Unfortunately, this is the case. Alex's confidence is clearly dented, but right now Pierre Gasly is doing everything possible to at least put himself back on the radar at Red Bull, to say I've had my tough experiences, I've gone back to the basics, and now I am a better driver than I was before. So if you want me back, I'm here. Let's do this. So certainly a lot to look out for Pierre in that regard. Just looking through the rest of the field, obviously a disappointing weekend, I would say, for Racing Point. Of course, losing Perez temporarily to COVID, and hopefully recovers and gets back soon. Of course, they weren't able to use the car for Nico Hulkenberg. It didn't start. And considering certainly my prediction last week, I predicted a Racing Point on the podium. And I mean, you were very nearly right. Of course, what happened to the 2 Mercedes kind of threw that out of whack. But Racing Point, surprisingly, a bit lackluster.
Yeah, it fell away. I was surprised, given that, the regular comment is that it is last year's Mercedes, and Mercedes are particularly strong around Silverstone. I'm actually quite baffled as to what happened with Racing Point's pace this weekend. I just have no idea where it went. Maybe they'll find it in this coming race. Who knows? But very surprising how much they fell back compared to the other midfield teams.
Yeah, we don't know if they were managing an issue or not. Maybe they were managing issues with their tyres, like Mercedes have obviously had problems given the similar hallmarks the two cars have. We don't know, but the qualifying performance was not there that we expected. We thought, and Friday practice, Lance Stroll was fastest in the morning. So very, very surprising that it didn't translate to the race, although the conditions were a lot different, and we'll talk about that in the final preview for the F1 70th anniversary Grand Prix, also at Silverstone. So 2 British Grand Prix back to back. But yeah, very surprising for Racing Point. A disappointing weekend considering how strong they've been so far this season. Of course, Renault once again launching the third protest against the Racing Point car. Not sure what the details are, but I'm guessing it's on the similar grounds of what they've already asked about before, owing to this very, very similar hallmarks that they have to the Mercedes W10 from last season. But of course, we'll have to wait and see what transpires from those investigations on the Racing Point to talk about that bit more. So, looking at the preview now for the last part of this episode, the preview for this race ahead, a couple of things worth noting. Of course, the temperatures that are so critical at Silverstone. We saw on Friday it was 34, 35 degrees, the hottest day in the year in the UK. And which for us, we can't handle that hot temperature. I think there's a saying about British people, Courtney, I think I'm right, is that we can handle almost any climate as long as it doesn't last longer than 2 days.
Yeah.
I think it's a fair say. Yeah.
Well, we can't handle a couple centimetres of snow, particularly in London. We can't handle 2 centimetres of snow, and we can't deal with leaves landing on our train tracks.
Yeah, pretty much. I think that sums us up. So for those of you international listeners that we so often are grateful for your support, it's amazing how far and wide this podcast reaches around the world, even its infant stages, because we've only been doing this since February, I think. And that's just how it is in Britain. That's British people to a T, I think, in terms of the weather. But this weekend, it's going to be very similar to that Friday practice session. Of course, all weekend, Friday, it's going to be 34, Saturday 31, Sunday 31, very, very hot conditions. And in those hot conditions, the drivers were struggling, particularly with the softer tyres, which will come to my next point now, that in order to make this interesting and to obviously not have a similar race to what we had this weekend, the FIA and Pirelli are going to go with 1 compound softer tyres to what they used last weekend. So for what that means, guys, is the harder tyres that were used this weekend will not be used. The medium tyres from last weekend will be the hard tyres. The soft tyres from this last weekend will be the medium. And of course, an even softer compound will become the new soft tyres. Given the increase in temperature, which is going to make it even more difficult on the tyres, Courtney, than it was this last weekend, and the fact that we're going 1 step softer, do we think that that's going to be potentially too dangerous given how the race ended last weekend? Of course, the idea is perhaps to create a 2-stop race rather than a 1-stopper, although there were a few guys had to stop twice. But do you think that, given the light of what's happened in last weekend's race and how it finished, that the FIA may decide to revert back to what we had this weekend, just gone? Or do you think that perhaps it's better to just go with what we've got and hopefully get a more enthralling race and a few more pit stops out of it?
So I think they will change it back to how it was the weekend just gone, because we all want to have entertaining races. Okay, we all want that. You know, we all like split strategy, and we missed that this race, and that's what made it boring. The fact there was a safety car early on in the race actually killed the race in terms of strategy. But going back, as much as we do want to have multiple stops and you don't know how the race is going to go, if you're putting safety at risk and you're just going to have drivers having punctures everywhere, it's actually quite dull in its own right. You want there to be some kind of spectacle. So I just feel that they will put it back to how it was. And I think even then, with the higher temperatures, it will cause a much more chaotic race. My 2 predictions for this race, I'd say, I reckon either Valtteri will bounce back, or if the temperatures are as high as they think it's going to be, I'm just getting Austria from last season feeling about it, mate. And I'm going to go with either Valtteri or Verstappen to win this race.
Yeah, I'm going to be a bit bold here. Because of the conditions and the temperatures and obviously how it transpired, I am going to go with Max Verstappen winning this race. We've said that Mercedes had issues with their reliability and their cooling and everything else, considering how tightly they packaged that car. And it's something they've had to manage. I think they did look like they seemed to struggle in practice to really get the grip of that car down on those softer tyres, which will be this week's mediums if, of course, the rules stay the same way in terms of tyre usage. So it might end up being a detriment to Mercedes. And that may be where Red Bull will be able to get that advantage, being able to attack Mercedes when they're not able to extract the maximum out of their car. So I'm going to go with the Max Verstappen win. I think he will win, and I think the two Mercedes will finish behind him because they will be hampered by the conditions. It's a bold one, and I would like to see someone else other than the two Mercedes wins. I think a lot of us probably would feel that way. But if it's going to happen, it probably will be this weekend. But of course, so many variables to consider. Maybe Hulkenberg may finally get that podium if he gets the chance to race, or perhaps if Sergio's racing, perhaps he can extract more out of the car than Stroll did. Of course, Friday when it was really hot, Stroll was fastest and then Max was fastest in the afternoon. So we'll have to wait to see how that transpires. It's certainly something to look forward to for the 70th anniversary Grand Prix for F1 at Silverstone once again. And I think that's probably a good opportunity to end this episode of the DNF1 podcast. We've just hit just over an hour. As often as we try to keep it a bit shorter, but we will get better at this as we go along. We could have discussions for days. Yeah, we have discussions for days on this, and it just gets so hard when we just waffle on and go off on a tangent. As we've often said in the past, not as much as recently, but still nonetheless, and risk of going off on another tangent, and I'll wrap this up. So for those of you that obviously been following us, you'll know that we've got the DNF1 Beginner's Guide Part 2 video coming out very, very soon. I'm aiming for it to be done by Friday evening, but of course, we'll have to wait and see. I'm working very hard to try and get that out for you guys, so hopefully it's out then. If you haven't seen the first part, make sure to check that out on the YouTube channel. It's really, really good. We're having a lot of great feedback from it so far. And the YouTube channel is DNF1-F1 podcast. So make sure to check that out. And of course, follow us on Twitter and social media and Instagram as well. So DNF1_podcast on both of those as well, especially the Instagram page. A lot of great content, a great way to interact with us as well. And all that's left to say, guys, is make sure to like, share and subscribe to us on whichever podcasting platform you listen to. And thank you very much again for tuning into another episode of the DNF1 podcast. Hope you enjoy this weekend's racing. If it's anything like the climax to the last one, I'm sure it would be a great race. So all that's left to say is thank you once again for joining us, Courtney.
Always a pleasure, mate.
And it's a goodbye from me as well. And we'll see you in the next episode of the DNF1 F1 podcast.
See you soon.